afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient elm trees of Rosemere, where Mrs. Constance Hartwell had spent the better part of the morning arranging her annual garden party with the precision of a military campaign. At 68, she possessed that particular brand of English gentility that spoke of old families and older money, though those who knew her well understood that both the family name and the fortune had come through her late husband's more industrious lineage rather than her own modest beginnings as a vicar's daughter. The garden itself was a testament to Mrs. Hartwell's desire for perfection, every rose bush pruned to mathematical precision, every pathway swept clean of even the most innocent fallen leaf. The long trestle tables bore starched white cloths that caught the breeze like sails, and upon them sat the finest china that Little Wickham could provide, borrowed from 3 different households to ensure sufficient grandeur. Miss Jane Marple had arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, as was proper, carrying her inevitable knitting bag and wearing her second-best summer dress of soft lavender. She had been invited by her dear friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who lived in the neighboring village and who maintained that a change of scenery would do Miss Marple good after her recent indisposition. Miss Marple had accepted with the gentle gratitude of one who understood that such invitations were as much about providing entertainment for the hostess as comfort for the guest. She settled herself in a wicker chair beneath the elm tree with her knitting. Today it was a baby's cardigan in the softest yellow wool, and began her quiet observation of the assembled company. Miss Marple had long ago discovered that nothing made one quite so invisible as a pair of clicking needles and an air of gentle absorption in domestic matters. People included her with the furniture and the flower arrangements and then forgot entirely that furniture might have eyes. The usual suspects of Little Wickham society had assembled with their customary punctuality. Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton arrived with his wife Eleanor, she clinging to his arm with the desperate devotion of a woman who had learned that a husband's attention was a commodity not to be taken for granted. Mr. James Whitfield, the local solicitor, bustled about with the cheerful efficiency of a man whose living depended upon other people's complications. The Reverend Mr. Ellison and his wife Alice had positioned themselves near the tea-urn with the strategic awareness of those who understood that social position required constant maintenance. But it was the arrival of the younger generation that provided the afternoon's most interesting undercurrents. Miss Catherine Hartwell, Mrs. Constance's stepdaughter, entered through the garden gate with the hesitant step of one who was never quite certain of her welcome. At 35, she possessed a quiet beauty that had somehow escaped the notice of Little Wickham's eligible bachelors, perhaps because her inheritance from her father's first marriage had made her simultaneously too independent for some men's comfort and too threatening for others' pride. Behind her came Mr. Julian Vance, a London gentleman of uncertain profession but certain charm, who had been paying Catherine marked attention for the past month. His presence had caused considerable speculation among the village ladies, particularly since his interest had coincided rather conveniently with the recent revelation that Catherine's inheritance was considerably larger than previously supposed. Miss Marple noticed, with the attention she gave to all domestic details, that Mrs. Hartwell had prepared her famous elderflower cordial for the occasion. The crystal glasses sat in perfect rows upon a silver tray, each garnished with a sprig of fresh mint from the garden. It was a tradition that dated back to Mrs. Hartwell's early days as mistress of Rosemere, when she had been eager to establish herself as a hostess of distinction. The afternoon proceeded with the measured rhythm of English social ritual. Conversation flowed in comfortable channels, the weather promising, the gardens admirable, and the gentle dissection of absent neighbors' characters inevitable. Mrs. Hartwell moved among her guests with the satisfaction of one whose arrangements had achieved their intended effect, pausing to ensure that glasses were filled and plates replenished. It was during the serving of the second course, delicate cucumber sandwiches and Mrs. Hartwell's celebrated lemon cake, that the hostess excused herself to fetch a photograph she wished to show Dr. Pemberton. Something about a mutual acquaintance from her late husband's regiment, she explained, disappearing into the house with her characteristic brisk step. 20 minutes passed before anyone remarked upon Mrs. Hartwell's absence. It was Catherine who first expressed concern, rising from her chair with a frown that aged her pleasant features considerably. "I do hope Constance hasn't taken ill," she said, though there was something in her voice that suggested hope was not precisely the emotion she was experiencing. Mr. Whitfield, ever the gentleman, offered to investigate. He found the morning-room door standing ajar, which struck him as odd given Mrs. Hartwell's meticulous attention to household order. The room beyond was filled with the golden light of late afternoon, streaming through windows that overlooked the very garden where 20 people continued their polite conversation, unaware that their hostess would never again concern herself with the proper arrangement of tea services. Mrs. Constance Hartwell sat in her favorite chair by the window, her head tilted back against the antimacassar she had embroidered herself during the early years of her marriage. Her eyes, which had spent a lifetime cataloguing the imperfections of others, now stared sightlessly at the ceiling she had repainted only the previous spring. On the small table beside her chair sat her glass of elderflower, cordial, half empty, with its sprig of mint now wilted and brown. But it was the faint, bitter scent that hung in the air, barely perceptible beneath the heavy perfume of the roses that filled every available vase, that told the true story. Miss Marple, who had followed the sounds of distress with the unhurried step of one who had seen too much of human nature to be easily shocked, stood in the doorway and inhaled delicately. "Dear me," she said softly, her voice carrying no more emphasis than if she had discovered a dropped stitch in her knitting. "Bitter almonds. How very careless of someone." The discovery transformed the gentle garden party into something altogether more sinister. Dr. Pemberton, summoned by Mr. Whitfield's urgent call, confirmed what Miss Marple's experienced nose had already detected. Mrs. Constance Hartwell had been poisoned, almost certainly with cyanide, administered in her elderflower cordial with a precision that suggested both premeditation and intimate knowledge of her habits. As the local constabulary was summoned and the guests gathered in shocked clusters on the lawn, Miss Marple remained in her wicker chair, her needles clicking steadily. She observed the way Catherine Hartwell's hands trembled as she poured fresh tea for the shaken guests, noticed how Julian Vance's charm seemed to desert him in the face of genuine crisis, and remarked to herself upon the curious fact that Mrs. Hartwell's glass bore no fingerprints save her own, as if someone had been very careful indeed about what they touched. The lady who had spent a lifetime arranging everything to perfection had, it seemed, finally encountered an arrangement she could not control. And Miss Marple, who understood that murder was rarely about the victim and always about the murderer, settled herself to observe what people did when they thought no one was watching. After all, as she had learned through many years of village life, it was often in the moments immediately following a tragedy that people revealed their truest selves, and sometimes their darkest secrets. The garden party was over, but the real entertainment was just beginning. The transformation from garden party to crime scene occurred with the peculiar efficiency that accompanies genuine tragedy. Within the hour, Inspector Leonard Pierce of the County Constabulary had arrived, a square-shouldered man whose deliberate movements and careful eyes suggested someone who had learned not to disturb evidence before understanding its significance. He brought with him the young Sergeant Vale, whose crisp uniform and earnest expression marked him as someone still new enough to the profession to find murder shocking rather than merely unfortunate. Miss Marple observed the inspector's arrival with the same quiet attention she had given to the afternoon's earlier proceedings. She noted how he paused at the garden gate to survey the assembled guests before approaching, how his gaze lingered on the arrangement of tables and chairs as if memorizing the geography of the crime. When he spoke to the gathered company, his voice carried the kind of authority that came from experience rather than rank. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid this matter will require your patience for some time longer. Inspector Pierce announced, removing his hat with courteous precision. "We shall need to speak with each of you individually, and I must ask that no one leave the premises until we've completed our preliminary inquiries." His eyes swept the group with professional assessment. "I understand this is distressing, but I'm sure you all wish to assist in discovering what happened to Mrs. Hartwell." The inspector's approach to questioning proved both thorough and revealing. He established himself in the drawing room, where the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains onto furniture that spoke of comfort rather than ostentation. Catherine Hartwell was called first, a courtesy that she accepted with the composed dignity of someone accustomed to shouldering responsibilities she had not chosen. Miss Marple, positioned strategically near the French doors where her knitting provided perfect camouflage for observation, watched the subtle interplay of personalities as each guest awaited their turn. Dr. Pemberton maintained his professional composure while his wife Eleanor grew increasingly agitated, her hands fluttering like trapped birds as she whispered urgent observations to anyone within hearing. The Reverend Mr. Ellison attempted to provide spiritual comfort to the group, though his efforts were somewhat undermined by his wife Alice's obvious eagerness to depart and share the news with the wider village. Julian Vance presented perhaps the most interesting study in controlled anxiety. His usual easy charm had given way to a brittle alertness, his eyes following Catherine's movements with protective intensity while simultaneously scanning the other guests as if calculating their potential threat. When he thought himself unobserved, his fingers drummed nervous rhythms against his thigh, betraying an inner tension that his cultivated exterior sought to conceal. Mr. Whitfield, the family solicitor, had appointed himself unofficial liaison between the guests and the authorities, a role that allowed him to hover near the drawing-room door during the interviews. Miss Marple noted how his professional discretion seemed to war with genuine concern, particularly where Catherine was involved. His knowledge of the household arrangements proved remarkably detailed for someone whose visits were supposedly limited to business matters. During Catherine's interview, which lasted nearly 30 minutes, the murmur of voices from within occasionally rose just enough for Miss Marple's acute hearing to catch fragments. The discussion seemed to focus heavily on Mrs. Hartwell's habits regarding the elder flower. Cordial, her routine use of the morning room for private conversations, and the timing of her departure from the garden. When Catherine emerged, her composure remained intact, but Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirt and the way her gaze avoided meeting Julian Vance's anxious eyes. Dr. Pemberton's interview proved equally illuminating, though for different reasons. His medical expertise regarding the probable cause of death was clearly valued by Inspector Pierce, but Miss Marple noticed how his wife Eleanor positioned herself near the door with the desperate attention of someone whose own security depended upon her husband's word. When the doctor mentioned the distinctive bitter almond scent that had led to his initial diagnosis of cyanide poisoning, Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was audible even from Miss Marple's position across the room. "Geoffrey always notices such things," Eleanor murmured to Mrs. Ellison, her voice carrying a note of pride mixed with something that might have been fear. "He has such a sensitive nose for unusual odors." The comment struck Miss Marple as oddly specific, the kind of detail that suggested familiarity with her husband's diagnostic methods that went beyond casual observation. Julian Vance's interview lasted the shortest time, though his obvious relief upon emerging suggested it had felt considerably longer. Inspector Pierce's questions had apparently focused on the length of his acquaintance with the Hartwell family and his movements during the crucial period when Mrs. Hartwell had excused herself from the garden. His answers, while clearly truthful in their specifics, seemed to leave certain implications hanging in the air like morning mist. As the formal questioning continued, the informal conversations among the remaining guests revealed as much about the crime as the official proceedings. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she absorbed the undercurrents of speculation and suspicion that began to surface once the initial shock had subsided. Mrs. Ellison, emboldened by her husband's temporary absence while he provided his statement, confided to Eleanor Pemberton that she had always found Mrs. Hartwell's management of her late husband's estate to be rather possessive. The implication, delicately conveyed, was that Catherine's inheritance had been a source of ongoing tension between stepmother and stepdaughter. Of course, dear Catherine has always been so patient about it all, Mrs. Ellison continued, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper that accompanied the most damaging observations. But one did wonder how long such forbearance could last, especially with a young man paying her such marked attention. Mrs. Hartwell was not encouraging about the match. Eleanor Pemberton's response proved equally revealing. Constance always said that Catherine lacked proper gratitude for her advantages. And she was quite pointed about Mr. Vance's sudden interest coinciding with the recent reassessment of the estate's value. Her glance toward Julian, who stood apart near the rose garden, carried unmistakable implications. Miss Marple found these observations fascinating not for their content, which was predictable enough, but for what they revealed about the speaker's own preoccupations. Village gossip, she had long observed, often said more about the gossips than their subjects. Mrs. Ellison's focus on inheritance matters suggested someone who paid careful attention to financial arrangements, while Eleanor Pemberton's comments about gratitude and sudden romantic interest spoke to deeper anxieties about security and genuine affection. Meanwhile, the physical evidence was yielding its own story. Sergeant Vale had discovered that the elderflower cordial had been prepared fresh that morning by Mrs. Hartwell herself, using elderflowers from the garden and her special crystal pitcher. The poison had clearly been added to her individual glass rather than the common supply, which required both opportunity and intimate knowledge of her habits. Most significantly, the morning room showed no signs of disturbance or forced entry, strongly suggesting that the murderer was someone familiar with the house and trusted enough to move about freely. Inspector Pierce's examination of the medicine cabinet proved particularly enlightening. Mrs. Hartwell, like many ladies of her generation and social position, maintained a well-stocked supply of various tonics and remedies. Among these, he discovered a small brown bottle with a partially removed label, containing what appeared to be cherry laurel water, a substance that, while having legitimate medicinal uses in proper doses, contained the same prussic acid that had killed Mrs. Hartwell. The discovery sent ripples of unease through the assembled guests. Cherry laurel water was not an uncommon household remedy, used for everything from nervous headaches to digestive complaints. Its presence in Mrs. Hartwell's medicine cabinet was entirely unremarkable. What was remarkable was that the bottle appeared to have been recently disturbed, with fingerprint smudges around the cork that suggested hasty handling. As the afternoon wore into evening and the inspector concluded his preliminary investigation, the official theory began to take shape. Someone with access to the house and knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's habits had used her own medicine to poison her elderflower cordial. The timing suggested premeditation, while the method indicated familiarity with both her routines and her medical supplies. Miss Marple, gathering her knitting as the guests were finally permitted to disperse, reflected on the curious selectivity of human observation. Everyone had noticed Mrs. Hartwell's departure from the garden, but no one had remarked upon who else might have briefly absented themselves during that crucial 20-minute period. Everyone recalled the timing of events, but no one seemed to have observed the small inconsistencies that spoke to careful preparation rather than spontaneous action. Most intriguingly, everyone assumed that Mrs. Hartwell had taken her fatal drink into the morning room with her, yet Miss Marple distinctly remembered seeing the hostess leave the garden empty-handed, mentioning only her intention to fetch a photograph. The glass of elderflower cordial had been waiting for her, prepared by someone who knew exactly where she would go and what she would do when she arrived. As Dolly Bantry's motor car carried them away from Rosemere, Miss Marple found herself thinking not about the obvious suspects or their apparent motives, but about the photograph that Mrs. Hartwell had supposedly gone to retrieve. Inspector Pierce had found no such photograph in the morning room, nor any evidence that Mrs. Hartwell had been searching for one when she died. The excuse had been false, which raised the question of whether Mrs. Hartwell had invented it herself, or whether someone else had suggested the errand that led to her death. "Such a dreadful business, Jane," Dolly murmured as the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead came into view. "Though I suppose it will all be sorted out quickly enough. These things usually are, aren't they? Someone with an obvious motive and too much opportunity." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple agreed gently, her fingers automatically smoothing the yellow wool in her lap. "People do so prefer obvious solutions. They're much more comfortable than complicated ones." She paused, watching the evening shadows lengthen across the peaceful countryside. "Though in my experience, Dolly, the most obvious solution is often the most carefully arranged. Real life, you know, is seldom quite so tidy as people would like it to be." The murder at Rosemere had indeed provided Little Wickham with an obvious solution, complete with clear motives and convenient suspects. But Miss Marple had learned, through many years of observing human nature in all its complexity, that when a crime appeared too perfectly logical, it was often because someone had taken great care to make it appear exactly that way. And in her experience, the people who took such care were rarely the ones upon whom suspicion naturally fell. The real investigation, she suspected, was only just beginning. The morning after Mrs. Hartwell's murder dawned with the peculiar quality of light that follows tragedy in small villages, where ordinary sunshine seems somehow tentative, as if uncertain of its welcome in a world suddenly made sinister. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, her movements unhurried though her mind had been occupied for much of the night with the curious details that others might dismiss as inconsequential. She had learned, through many years of observing human nature, that murder was rarely about grand gestures, but rather about small inconsistencies that revealed the careful planning behind apparent spontaneity. The familiar ritual of morning tea provided a comforting framework for her thoughts to settle into order. People, she reflected as she measured the leaves with precise frugality, very seldom altered their habitual ways unless they had compelling reasons. Mrs. Hartwell's death had been achieved through an intimate knowledge of her preferences and routines, suggesting someone who had observed her closely enough to predict her movements with deadly accuracy. Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived before 9, her motorcar crunching on the gravel with unusual urgency. Her face bore the expression of someone who had spent the night processing shocking events and had emerged with theories that demanded immediate sharing. She settled herself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the satisfaction of one whose information was certain to prove both valuable and disturbing. "Jane, my dear, you simply cannot imagine what Little Wickham is saying this morning," Dolly announced, accepting the offered cup with hands that trembled slightly. "The entire village is convinced that Catherine must be responsible. After all, she stands to inherit everything, and everyone knows there was tension between her and Constance about that Mr. Vance." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she absorbed this predictable development. Village opinion, she had observed, typically settled on the most obvious suspect with remarkable speed, as if the community's collective anxiety could be relieved by identifying a culprit, regardless of evidence. "And what does the village make of Mr. Vance's role in all this?" she inquired gently. "Oh, they're quite divided about him. Some think he's an opportunist who saw his chance when Catherine's inheritance became known. Others believe he's simply an unfortunate young man caught up in circumstances beyond his control." Dolly paused, her expression growing more troubled. "But Jane, there's something else. Dr. Pemberton stopped by this morning, and he seemed quite concerned about the medical aspects of the case." This information proved far more interesting than village gossip. Dr. Pemberton's professional opinion carried weight that speculation could not match, and his willingness to share concerns suggested genuine doubts about the current direction of the investigation. Miss Marple set down her cup with careful attention. "What particular aspects troubled him, my dear?" "He said that the concentration of poison in Constance's system suggested death would have occurred within minutes of ingestion, yet she apparently walked calmly from the garden to the morning room and seated herself comfortably. He found that level of composure unusual for someone experiencing cyanide poisoning." Dolly's voice dropped to the whisper reserved for medical discussions that ventured into uncomfortable territory. Miss Marple found this observation significant for several reasons. If Mrs. Hartwell had consumed the poison before leaving the garden, her composed departure seemed unlikely. If she had taken it after reaching the morning room, then someone had prepared the fatal drink and left it waiting for her, which required not only premeditation, but confidence that she would consume it without suspicion. Did Dr. Pemberton mention anything about the glass itself, or how the poison might have been administered? Miss Marple asked, though her tone suggested casual curiosity rather than systematic inquiry. "He seemed puzzled by the mint garnish," Dolly replied, frowning as she recalled the conversation. Apparently, Constance always used spearmint with her elderflower cordial, but the sprig in the fatal glass was peppermint. He thought it might be significant, though Inspector Pierce seemed to consider it a minor detail. The information struck Miss Marple as anything but minor. In her experience, such small deviations from established habits often revealed the most about a crime's true nature. Someone unfamiliar with Mrs. Hartwell's preferences might easily mistake one mint for another, or someone in haste might grab the wrong variety without noticing the difference. Later that morning, Miss Marple found herself accompanying Mrs. Bantry on what was ostensibly a condolence call to Catherine Hartwell, though both ladies understood that curiosity played an equal role in their motivation. The drive to Rosemere provided an opportunity to observe how little Wickham was processing the tragedy, and Miss Marple noted the clusters of villagers engaged in urgent conversation, the way conversations paused as their motor passed, and the general atmosphere of excitement poorly disguised as concern. Rosemere itself appeared unchanged from the previous day, its manicured grounds showing no trace of the drama that had unfolded among the rosebeds and tea tables. Mr. Whitfield met them at the door with the careful courtesy of someone managing a household in crisis, his professional composure intact, though his eyes showed the strain of sleepless worry. Catherine received them in the small sitting room at the back of the house, where French doors opened onto an herb garden that Miss Marple observed with particular interest. The young woman's composure remained remarkable under the circumstances, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of a difficult night. Her gratitude for their visit seemed genuine, unmarked by the theatrical grief that might have suggested guilt or the brittle cheerfulness that often accompanied innocence trying too hard to prove itself. "Inspector Pierce has been most thorough," Catherine said, her voice steady though quiet. "He's examined everything twice over, spoken to all the staff, and reconstructed the afternoon's events in considerable detail. I believe he's satisfied that the poison was added to Constance's glass sometime after she left the garden." Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing of this statement, which conveyed information without revealing Catherine's own theories about the crime. "Has he discovered how the poisoner knew which glass was hers?" she asked, her tone carrying no more emphasis than if she were discussing the weather. The glasses were all identical, but Constance had a habit of marking hers with a small scratch on the base. She was rather particular about such things, and preferred to use the same glass throughout an occasion. Catherine's explanation revealed intimate knowledge of her stepmother's habits, while simultaneously providing information that narrowed the field of potential murderers to those familiar with such domestic details. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Julian Vance, who appeared at the garden door with the hesitant step of someone uncertain of his welcome. His usual easy charm had been replaced by a brittle alertness that suggested someone operating under considerable strain. When he greeted Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, his courtesy was impeccable, but his attention remained focused on Catherine with protective intensity. "I've just come from speaking with Inspector Pierce again," he announced, settling into the offered chair with movements that suggested barely controlled anxiety. He seems particularly interested in my knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's domestic arrangements, especially her habit of keeping refreshments in the morning room. Miss Marple found this information intriguing for what it revealed about the inspector's thinking. If Julian Vance's familiarity with household routines was considered suspicious, then the investigation was focusing on those with intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's habits rather than casual acquaintances who might have acted impulsively. "Did Mrs. Hartwell often entertain visitors in the morning room?" she inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer from her observations of the previous day. "It was her preferred location for private conversations," Catherine replied. She found the garden too public for serious discussions, and the drawing room too formal for comfortable conversation. The morning room struck the proper balance between privacy and propriety. The detail reinforced Miss Marple's growing conviction that the murder had been planned by someone who understood not only Mrs. Hartwell's physical habits, but her social preferences as well. The choice of location suggested someone who knew she could be lured there reliably and who understood that she would be unlikely to suspect danger in her own private sanctuary. Mr. Whitfield appeared at this moment to request a private word with Catherine, his professional discretion warring visibly with personal concern. When Catherine nodded her permission, he addressed the group with the careful formality of someone about to reveal information that was both significant and potentially damaging. "I believe it's important that you know Mrs. Hartwell had asked me to prepare a codicil to her will," he said, his voice carrying the weight of legal responsibility. "Nothing dramatic, you understand, but some adjustments to the charitable bequests and a modification of the terms governing Miss Catherine's inheritance." The revelation created a moment of charged silence as everyone absorbed the implications. Miss Marple noted Julian Vance's sharp intake of breath, and the way his gaze immediately sought Catherine's face, as if gauging her reaction to news that might affect their future together. "What sort of modifications?" Catherine asked, her voice carefully controlled. "The changes would have given you immediate control of your full inheritance rather than the current arrangement of periodic allowances," Whitfield explained. "Mrs. Hartwell intended to present this as a gesture of confidence in your maturity and judgment. She planned to discuss it with you after the garden party, when everyone was in good spirits." Miss Marple found the timing of this intended revelation fascinating. If Mrs. Hartwell had been planning to increase Catherine's independence and financial control, it eliminated the most obvious motive for murder, while simultaneously creating new questions about who else might have been threatened by such changes. As the morning progressed and the conversation continued, Miss Marple excused herself to examine the herb garden more closely. The neat beds contained the usual domestic varieties: thyme, rosemary, sage, and 2 distinct patches of mint. The spearmint grew in orderly rows near the kitchen door, its smooth-edged leaves pale green in the morning light. The peppermint occupied a vigorous patch along the back wall, its darker serrated leaves and stronger scent making it easily distinguishable from its cousin. Anyone familiar with the garden would know the difference, yet someone had chosen peppermint for Mrs. Hartwell's fatal drink. The error suggested either ignorance of her preferences or haste that prevented careful selection. Miss Marple found both possibilities significant, though for different reasons. Returning to the sitting room, she discovered that Inspector Pierce had arrived and was conducting what appeared to be a follow-up interview with Catherine. His questions seemed to focus on the missing photograph that Mrs. Hartwell had supposedly gone to retrieve, and Miss Marple noted Catherine's growing puzzlement as she attempted to identify what picture her stepmother might have been seeking. She mentioned wanting to show Dr. Pemberton a photograph from her late husband's regimental dinner, Catherine explained. "Something about identifying one of the officers for a mutual acquaintance, but I've looked through all the albums, and I cannot find any such photograph missing." Inspector Pierce's expression suggested this confirmation of his own findings, though he seemed uncertain about its significance. Miss Marple, however, found the missing photograph increasingly important. If Mrs. Hartwell had fabricated the excuse to leave the garden, it suggested either spontaneous deception or response to some external prompt. If someone else had suggested the errand, it indicated premeditation of the most calculated sort. As the official interview concluded and Inspector Pierce prepared to depart, Miss Marple approached him with the diffident manner of an elderly lady seeking clarification on domestic details. "Inspector, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I couldn't help noticing yesterday that Mrs. Hartwell's glass bore only her own fingerprints. Might I ask whether you discovered any other evidence of handling?" Pierce regarded her with the cautious respect of a professional who had learned not to dismiss civilian observations entirely. The glass had been wiped clean and then handled only by Mrs. Hartwell herself, he confirmed. Someone took considerable care to avoid leaving traces. The information confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the calculated nature of the crime. Such careful attention to evidence suggested someone with either criminal experience or sufficient intelligence to anticipate police methods. It also indicated premeditation rather than crime of passion, which narrowed the field of suspects considerably. As she and Mrs. Bantry prepared to take their leave, Miss Marple made one final observation that would prove significant. In the morning room, she noticed that the family album lay open to a page where a photograph had clearly been removed, leaving only the corner mounting tabs and a small fragment of black paper. The rectangular ghost was precise, suggesting careful removal rather than accidental loss. "Catherine, my dear," she said gently, "this missing photograph. Had anyone else shown interest in your family albums recently?" Catherine considered the question carefully before responding. "Mr. Whitfield borrowed this album last week to examine some old property photographs for a deed research. And Dr. Pemberton mentioned once that he thought he recognized someone in one of the military pictures. But I cannot imagine why either of them would remove anything." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, filing the information alongside her growing collection of small inconsistencies and curious details. The photograph's removal, the wrong mint variety, the wiped glass, the fabricated errand, each element suggested careful planning by someone intimately familiar with both the household and Mrs. Hartwell's habits. During the drive back to St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Bantry expressed frustration with the apparent lack of progress in the investigation. "It seems as though everyone had motive and opportunity, Jane. Catherine for her inheritance, Julian for his prospects, even Dr. Pemberton with his medical knowledge. How does one choose among them?" "Perhaps, my dear Dolly, the question is not who had the most obvious motive, but who had the most compelling need to act immediately," Miss Marple replied, her fingers automatically smoothing the yellow wool in her lap. "In my experience, murder is rarely about what people might gain, but about what they fear to lose." The observation carried particular weight as Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. Mrs. Hartwell's planned codicil would have eliminated Catherine's financial dependence. The missing photograph suggested someone's concern about identification, and the careful preparation of the crime indicated fear of discovery rather than hope of gain. As evening approached and Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair with her knitting, she found herself thinking not about the obvious suspects and their apparent motives, but about the subtle patterns that emerged when small details were considered together. Someone had known Mrs. Hartwell well enough to predict her movements, yet had made small errors that suggested either unfamiliarity with her preferences or actions taken under pressure. The real murderer, Miss Marple suspected, would prove to be someone who had managed to remain in the background while others drew suspicion. Someone whose connection to the victim was strong enough to provide opportunity, but subtle enough to avoid immediate notice. The investigation was indeed progressing, though perhaps not in the direction that Inspector Pierce currently anticipated. Most significantly, the careful staging of the crime suggested someone who understood not only Mrs. Hartwell's habits, but the likely course of the subsequent investigation. Such foresight indicated either criminal sophistication or intimate knowledge of how suspicion would naturally fall. In Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human nature well enough to manipulate it, directing attention toward obvious suspects while remaining safely invisible themselves. The Evening Post brought no surprises, but Miss Marple found herself anticipating tomorrow's developments with the quiet satisfaction of someone who sensed that the truth was beginning to emerge from beneath its careful camouflage of misdirection and false clues. The morning after Mrs. Hartwell's murder dawned with a persistent drizzle that seemed to wash the color from Little Wickham's usually cheerful gardens, leaving behind a landscape as subdued as the village's collective mood. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, though her sleep had been punctuated by thoughts of small inconsistencies that refused to settle into comfortable patterns. The gentle patter of rain against her cottage windows provided a soothing counterpoint to the mental sorting of details that experience had taught her was essential in unraveling the truth behind carefully constructed deceptions. By the time she had finished her morning tea, news had already begun its inevitable circulation through the village's network of shopkeepers, gardeners, and concerned neighbors. Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived before 9 with the breathless urgency of someone who had spent the night processing shocking revelations and emerged with theories that demanded immediate sharing. "Jane, my dear, you simply cannot imagine what Little Wickham is saying this morning," Dolly announced, settling into the offered chair with visible agitation. "The entire village has convinced itself that Julian Vance must be responsible. After all his sudden appearance in Catherine's life, those creditor letters Inspector Pierce discovered, and now the servants are whispering about peppermint lozenges found in his pocket." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she absorbed this predictable development. Village opinion, she had long observed, typically settled upon the most obvious suspect with remarkable speed, as if the community's collective anxiety could be relieved by identifying a culprit, regardless of the actual evidence supporting such conclusions. The morning brought Inspector Pierce to her door with the measured step of a man whose investigation had reached a troubling crossroads. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of genuine frustration, and he accepted her offered tea with the gratitude of someone whose professional certainties had been shaken by accumulating contradictions. "Miss Marple, I find myself in need of a different perspective on this Hartwell matter," Pierce admitted, settling into her garden chair despite the light rain. "The evidence points in several directions simultaneously, and I confess that straightforward police methods seem insufficient to navigate these particular contradictions." Miss Marple continued her careful attention to the yellow wool in her lap, providing the comfortable framework of domestic routine that often encouraged difficult admissions. "What particular aspects trouble you most, Inspector?" "The timing, primarily. Mr. Vance certainly had financial motives. We've confirmed substantial debts and creditors pressing for payment. His romantic interest in Miss Catherine coincided rather conveniently with the recent reassessment of her inheritance's value." Pierce paused, studying his notes with professional frustration. Yet if he intended murder, why choose the garden party? Why not arrange a private moment when there would be no witnesses to his movements? The inspector's next revelation proved even more significant. His more detailed examination of the crime scene had revealed traces of cherry laurel water on the morning room windowsill, indicating that the poison had been prepared in that very location, rather than transported from elsewhere. This discovery suggested someone comfortable enough in the house to work undisturbed in Mrs. Hartwell's private sanctuary. "The preparation required several minutes of careful work," Pierce explained. "Extracting sufficient prussic acid from the cherry laurel water, mixing it with elderflower cordial, ensuring proper concentration for rapid effect. This wasn't spontaneous violence, but deliberate murder, requiring both specialized knowledge and confident access to the victim's private spaces." Miss Marple found this information illuminating for several reasons. The morning room preparation suggested someone who knew Mrs. Hartwell's movements well enough to predict when the space would be available for such work. It also indicated confidence that the victim would consume the prepared drink without suspicion, which required either complete trust or careful masking of the poison's characteristic bitter taste. Their conversation was interrupted by an urgent knocking that brought Mr. Whitfield to the cottage door, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of genuine distress. The family solicitor's typically composed demeanor had given way to barely controlled anxiety, and his greeting to Inspector Pierce carried undertones of information that could no longer be contained. "Inspector, I'm relieved to find you here. I've discovered something that fundamentally alters our understanding of this case," Whitfield announced, accepting Miss Marple's offer of shelter from the rain with obvious gratitude. "I've been conducting a thorough review of Mrs. Hartwell's financial arrangements, and I've uncovered irregularities that trouble me deeply." The revelation that followed cast the entire investigation in dramatically different light. Mrs. Hartwell's estate, while appearing substantial to outside observers, had been systematically depleted over the past 18 months through a series of investments that had proved catastrophically unsuccessful. The losses had been carefully concealed through creative accounting and delayed reporting, but the reality was that Catherine's supposed inheritance had been reduced by nearly 60% of its assumed value. Mrs. Hartwell was desperate to recover these losses before Catherine discovered the extent of the financial damage. Whitfield explained, his professional discretion finally yielding to personal concern. She had been exploring various schemes to restore the estate's value, some of which were questionable in their legitimacy and legality. Miss Marple absorbed this information while considering its profound implications. If Mrs. Hartwell had been facing financial ruin, her planned codicil granting Catherine immediate control of the inheritance took on an entirely different meaning. Rather than a generous gesture of trust, it might have been a desperate attempt to transfer responsibility for the depleted estate before the losses became impossible to conceal. Who else possessed knowledge of these financial difficulties? Inspector Pierce asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the complexity of the answer. Dr. Pemberton had been advising her on some of the investment opportunities, using his London medical contacts to identify what appeared to be lucrative ventures, Whitfield replied reluctantly. Mr. Vance had also been consulted, given his claimed background in financial matters, and I had been pressuring Mrs. Hartwell to confess the situation to Catherine before it became impossible to manage. This financial crisis provided compelling new motives while simultaneously explaining certain puzzling aspects of the crime's timing. If Dr. Pemberton had been involved in the failed investments, his medical knowledge combined with financial desperation created a powerful incentive for preventing Mrs. Hartwell's planned revelations. Similarly, Julian Vance's romantic pursuit of Catherine might have been threatened by the discovery that her inheritance was largely illusory. The conversation took another significant turn when Inspector Pierce shared Dr. Pemberton's professional concerns about the medical aspects of the poisoning. Dr. Pemberton has been troubled by certain anomalies in the case. He insists that cyanide poisoning typically causes immediate, violent symptoms that would have made Mrs. Hartwell's composed departure from the garden highly improbable. Miss Marple found this medical puzzle particularly intriguing. "What alternative did Dr. Pemberton suggest, Inspector?" "He speculated about a preliminary sedative, something to render her disoriented or compliant before the fatal dose was administered," Pierce replied, consulting his notes. "However, we found no traces of additional substances in her system. What we did discover, through his professional knowledge of her health, was that Mrs. Hartwell had recently been experiencing episodes of vertigo and occasional memory lapses. This revelation struck Miss Marple as extraordinarily significant. A woman accustomed to perfect control suddenly finding herself vulnerable to disorientation would explain how she might have been induced to consume the poisoned cordial without recognizing its bitter taste or understanding her danger. It also suggested a killer who possessed intimate knowledge of her private physical vulnerabilities, not merely her social habits and domestic routines. The afternoon brought additional developments that further complicated the investigation's apparent progress. Andrews, the estate's taciturn gardener, had discovered evidence of recent disturbance in the herb garden that provided new insights into the crime's physical details. The peppermint patch showed several stems crudely broken rather than properly cut, and the damp earth bore the impression of what he described as dainty heel marks. Not the heavy boots of a man, but the narrower footprint of someone moving hastily through the garden in unsuitable footwear. Someone was in a hurry and not careful where she put her feet, Andrews had observed with professional disapproval, though Miss Marple noted his unconscious use of the feminine pronoun with particular interest. As the day progressed and Inspector Pierce continued his methodical examination of evidence and testimony, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological aspects of a crime that demonstrated both intimate knowledge of the victim and sophisticated understanding of how the subsequent investigation would likely proceed. The murderer had chosen a method that created maximum confusion about motive and opportunity, while simultaneously directing suspicion toward the most obvious suspects. The missing photograph continued to occupy her thoughts as a crucial element in understanding the killer's true identity. Mrs. Hartwell's fabricated excuse for leaving the garden, the carefully removed picture from the family album, and the timing that coincided with the final preparations for murder all suggested coordination that had been weeks in the making. Most significantly, the financial crisis revelation had provided a timeline for the crime that transcended the garden party itself. Mrs. Hartwell's death had prevented not only the signing of the codicil that would have benefited Catherine, but also the inevitable disclosure of the estate's true condition. Someone had understood that her continued life would lead to revelations that threatened their own security or reputation. As evening approached, the investigation's various threads began weaving themselves into a more coherent pattern. Miss Marple reflected on the curious selectivity of human observation. Everyone had noticed Mrs. Hartwell's departure from the garden, yet no one had remarked upon other brief absences during that crucial period. Everyone recalled the general timing of events, but no one had observed the small preparations that suggested careful orchestration rather than spontaneous opportunity. The case was indeed progressing toward resolution, though perhaps not in the direction that village opinion or obvious evidence initially suggested. The real murderer, Miss Marple suspected, would prove to be someone who had managed to remain safely in the background while others drew suspicion, someone whose connection to Mrs. Hartwell provided both motive and opportunity, while their public persona deflected serious scrutiny. The careful staging of evidence, the intimate knowledge of the victim's vulnerabilities, and the sophisticated understanding of how suspicion would naturally develop all pointed toward a killer who understood human nature well enough to manipulate it effectively. In Miss Marple's considerable experience, such psychological sophistication often belonged to those whose professional or social positions required them to study and influence others' behavior. Doctors who diagnosed human ailments, solicitors who managed human conflicts, or simply those who had spent years observing village life with the patience and attention that eventually revealed everyone's secrets. Tomorrow, she anticipated, would bring the kind of revelation that transforms an investigation from a collection of puzzling contradictions into a clear understanding of how one person's desperation had led them to believe that murder was preferable to exposure. The truth, as always, would prove both simpler and more complex than anyone had initially imagined. The morning following Mr. Whitfield's devastating financial revelations brought a subtle but unmistakable shift in the investigation's direction. Though Inspector Pierce maintained his characteristic caution about drawing premature conclusions, the discovery that Mrs. Hartwell's estate had been systematically depleted through failed investments had transformed what appeared to be a straightforward inheritance murder into something far more complex, with financial desperation potentially affecting multiple suspects rather than providing a single clear motive. Miss Marple had spent the early hours in careful contemplation, her knitting needles moving with automatic precision, while her mind sorted through the implications of professional betrayal, concealed losses, and the kind of secrets that drove seemingly respectable people to contemplate murder as preferable to exposure. The revelation that Dr. Pemberton had been involved in Mrs. Hartwell's investment schemes added layers of complexity to his role in both her life and death, transforming him from helpful medical advisor to someone with compelling reasons to prevent disclosure of the estate's true condition. The village, meanwhile, had seized upon Julian Vance with the collective relief of a community desperate to identify a suitable culprit. By mid-morning, Inspector Pierce found himself under considerable pressure to formalize charges against the young man, whose financial difficulties and romantic timing had created what appeared to be a perfectly logical motive. The discovery of peppermint lozenges in Vance's pocket had provided the kind of tangible evidence that satisfied public opinion, even though Miss Marple noted that such confections were common enough to be found in half the handbags and pockets in Little Wickham. Eleanor Pemberton's arrival at Miss Marple's cottage before 9 o'clock suggested someone whose composure had finally cracked under accumulated pressure. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night, and her hands trembled as she accepted the offered chair with obvious gratitude for a sympathetic ear. "Miss Marple, I find myself in the most dreadful position," Eleanor began, her voice carrying the weight of secrets that could no longer be contained. "My husband has been terribly troubled by this whole affair, and I fear that his involvement with Mrs. Hartwell's financial arrangements was far more extensive than he initially admitted to Inspector Pierce." Miss Marple continued her gentle attention to the morning's knitting while providing the comfortable framework that often encouraged difficult admissions. Eleanor's obvious distress suggested information of considerable significance, though experience had taught Miss Marple to distinguish between genuine confession and the protective fabrications of loyal spouses. Geoffrey had not merely advised Mrs. Hartwell on investments. Eleanor continued, her composure beginning to fracture. He had actually guaranteed several of them with his own professional reputation and, I'm afraid, with funds from his medical practice. When the investments failed, Mrs. Hartwell became quite desperate, threatening to expose his involvement unless he could find ways to recover the losses. The admission revealed financial entanglement that provided powerful new motives while explaining Dr. Pemberton's particular knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's vulnerabilities. If his medical practice had been compromised by the failed investments, professional ruin would have followed any exposure of the estate's true condition. More significantly, it established a timeline of mounting pressure that coincided perfectly with the garden party murder. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "had your husband mentioned Mrs. Hartwell's recent health difficulties to you? Her episodes of vertigo and occasional confusion?" The question prompted another significant revelation. Dr. Pemberton had indeed been treating Mrs. Hartwell for what he diagnosed as early arterial insufficiency, a condition that caused periodic disorientation. More importantly, he had been providing her with a mild sedative to manage anxiety attacks, medication that would have made her more vulnerable to poison while potentially masking its bitter taste. Geoffrey was genuinely concerned about her health, Eleanor admitted reluctantly. But I fear his financial desperation may have led him to see her condition as an opportunity rather than merely a medical challenge. He knew exactly how the sedative affected her judgment and reaction time. Miss Marple found this information illuminating for several reasons. A sedated victim might not react violently to cyanide poisoning or even register the characteristic bitter taste, which explained Dr. Pemberton's puzzlement about Mrs. Hartwell's composed departure from the garden. It also suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both her medical vulnerabilities and her daily routines. As Eleanor's revelations continued, Miss Marple noted the woman's unconscious gestures, particularly the way she repeatedly smoothed her skirt and glanced toward the door as if expecting interruption. When Eleanor mentioned having helped her husband prepare herbal remedies for patients, Miss Marple observed the faint staining on her fingertips that suggested recent contact with plant materials. "I've been assisting Geoffrey with preparing fresh mint infusions for certain stomach complaints," Eleanor explained when she noticed Miss Marple's glance. "He believes fresh herbs are more effective than dried preparations, though I'm afraid I've made rather a mess of my gardening gloves." The detail struck Miss Marple as potentially significant. Someone familiar with herbal preparations would understand the difference between spearmint and peppermint. Yet Mrs. Hartwell's fatal drink had been garnished with the wrong variety. Either the killer had been unfamiliar with her preferences, or haste had prevented careful selection. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself accompanying Mrs. Bantry on what was ostensibly a condolence call to Catherine Hartwell, though both ladies understood that curiosity played an equal role in their motivation. The visit provided an opportunity to observe how the household was managing under the strain of suspicion and grief, while allowing Miss Marple to examine certain details that had occupied her thoughts since Eleanor's morning confession. Catherine received them in the small sitting room. Her composure remaining remarkable, though shadows beneath her eyes spoke of difficult nights. When Miss Marple inquired about Mrs. Hartwell's daily health routines, Catherine confirmed that her stepmother had indeed taken a regular herbal infusion each afternoon, prepared according to Dr. Pemberton's specifications. She always claimed it settled her nerves and helped with her occasional spells, Catherine explained. Dr. Pemberton had recommended it as a mild sedative, and she was quite religious about taking it at the same time each day. Miss Marple noted this information carefully. If Mrs. Hartwell had been accustomed to afternoon sedation, it would explain her vulnerability to additional medication while providing the killer with predictable timing for their preparations. Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Pierce's arrival for another round of questioning, this time focusing on the physical evidence discovered in the herb garden. The heel prints found near the peppermint patch had been measured and photographed, revealing what Andrews had described as dainty impressions, suggesting someone moving hastily through damp earth in unsuitable footwear. "The prints are quite distinct," Pierce explained to Catherine. "Narrow heels, approximately 2 inches high, with a pointed toe. Not the sort of shoe one would typically wear for garden work, which suggests someone who entered the area for a specific purpose rather than routine maintenance." Miss Marple found this detail particularly interesting when considered alongside Eleanor Pemberton's elegant but impractical footwear choices. During their morning conversation, she had noted Eleanor's pointed-toe shoes with narrow heels, exactly the type that would leave such impressions in soft earth. As the afternoon progressed and Inspector Pierce continued his methodical examination of evidence, Miss Marple excused herself for a quiet stroll through the garden. Her ostensible purpose was to admire the late-season blooms, but her actual focus was on the herb garden where the crucial evidence had been discovered. The peppermint patch showed clear signs of hasty harvesting, with several stems broken rather than properly cut. The contrast with the neat rows of spearmint near the kitchen door was striking, suggesting someone unfamiliar with proper herb gathering or working under considerable pressure. Most significantly, the disturbed area was positioned where someone could work unobserved from the house, while maintaining a clear view of the garden party proceedings. Returning to the sitting room, Miss Marple discovered that Inspector Pierce had uncovered additional information about the missing photograph. The torn corner remaining in the album bore faint pencil markings that appeared to be notations, possibly identifying individuals in the picture or noting significant details. "The markings suggest someone was using the photograph for reference purposes," Pierce explained, "perhaps identifying people for business or social connections. The removal appears to have been recent and deliberate rather than accidental loss." Miss Marple reflected on this information while considering Eleanor's earlier admissions about her husband's extensive involvement in Mrs. Hartwell's financial schemes. If Dr. Pemberton had been recruiting other investors through his professional network, a photograph showing his connections to questionable investment opportunities would have provided damaging evidence of his role in the estate's depletion. As evening approached and the various threads of evidence began weaving themselves into a more coherent pattern, Miss Marple found herself thinking not about the obvious suspects and their apparent motives, but about the psychological sophistication required to orchestrate such a carefully planned crime. The killer had demonstrated intimate knowledge of the victim's vulnerabilities, sophisticated understanding of how the investigation would proceed, and sufficient medical expertise to ensure the poison's effectiveness. Most significantly, the crime's timing had prevented not only Mrs. Hartwell's planned codicil that would have benefited Catherine, but also the inevitable disclosure of financial irregularities that threatened professional reputations and personal security. Someone had understood that continued investigation of the estate's condition would lead to revelations that made murder seem preferable to exposure. During the drive back to St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Bantry expressed frustration with the investigation's apparent complexity. "It seems as though everyone had secrets, Jane. Financial troubles, medical knowledge, access to the house. How does one distinguish between suspicious behavior and genuine guilt?" "Perhaps, my dear Dolly," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "The question is not who had the most obvious motive, but who possessed the specific combination of knowledge, opportunity, and desperate necessity that made this particular crime both possible and inevitable." The observation carried particular weight as Miss Marple reflected on Eleanor Pemberton's morning revelations, the physical evidence from the herb garden, and the sophisticated planning that had nearly succeeded in directing suspicion toward more obvious suspects. The real murderer had managed to remain safely in the background while others drew attention, someone whose professional position provided perfect camouflage for both the crimes, preparation, and their participation in the subsequent investigation. As she settled into a familiar evening routine, Miss Marple found herself anticipating the next day's developments with quiet certainty. The truth was indeed beginning to emerge from beneath its careful camouflage of misdirection and false clues, though the final revelation would require one more crucial piece of evidence to transform suspicion into certainty. In her considerable experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human nature well enough to manipulate it, directing attention toward obvious suspects while remaining safely invisible themselves. The investigation had reached a critical juncture where accumulated evidence was beginning to point toward a conclusion that would surprise little Wickham considerably, though perhaps not one elderly lady whose patient observation of human nature had taught her to look beyond surface appearances to the deeper truths that lay beneath. The morning following Eleanor Pemberton's troubling revelations brought Inspector Pierce to Miss Marple's cottage with a proposal that demonstrated both professional thoroughness and psychological insight. The inspector had concluded that a careful reconstruction of the garden party's final hour might prompt memories that formal questioning had failed to elicit, particularly regarding the crucial 20 minutes when Mrs. Hartwell had excused herself from the gathering. Miss Marple found herself accompanying Mrs. Bantry back to Rosemere, where the principal guests had been asked to position themselves as they recalled from that fateful afternoon. The exercise possessed an almost theatrical quality, with empty spaces marking where chairs had left impressions in the grass, and a few wilted rose petals still clinging to the lawn like fragments of interrupted celebration. The absence of Mrs. Hartwell herself created a haunting quality, as if the melody of the afternoon remained incomplete without its central figure. Inspector Pierce's approach proved both methodical and revealing. Rather than pressing for dramatic admissions, he simply asked each person to indicate when they had briefly left their positions during that final half hour, using ordinary anchors of memory. The arrival of fresh tea, a comment about the weather, laughter following someone's anecdote. The responses revealed the small confusions that arise when people transpose familiar habits onto unfamiliar circumstances, though Miss Marple noted these discrepancies without immediately judging their significance. Eleanor Pemberton's recollection proved particularly detailed. She described going inside to fetch her shawl, mentioning a draught across the lawn and her concern that Mrs. Hartwell would later regret choosing such a light dress for the occasion. She even provided specifics about the shawl, dove grey with a small tear at the fringe that she had been meaning to mend. Catherine nodded confirmation of the garment's existence, yet Miss Marple, who possessed precise recall for such domestic details, could not remember seeing any shawl when Eleanor had rejoined the party. The afternoon's most significant revelation came from Maria, the parlour maid, whose nervous testimony provided crucial information about the fatal cordial's delivery. Standing near the French doors where she had been positioned during the party, Maria gathered courage to explain that a lady had asked her to take a fresh cordial to the morning room on a small tray, saying it would be a kindness as Mrs. Hartwell would be ready for refreshment. Maria's hands had been occupied with other duties, so she had left the prepared tray on the side table by the door, assuming the lady would deliver it herself. "Do you recall who made this request?" Inspector Pierce asked with careful gentleness. Maria's description, while incomplete, proved illuminating. She remembered a brooch with blue stones arranged like a small flower and a scent of violets that had lingered after the lady passed. Miss Marple noted how several guests' eyes moved reflexively. Mrs. Ellison glancing toward Eleanor's lapel, Catherine's gaze seeking Miss Marple's reaction, Julian's hand stilling on his chair back. The forget-me-not brooch in sapphires that Eleanor had worn was indeed distinctive, as was her preference for violet-scented perfume. During the reconstruction, Miss Marple excused herself to examine the herb garden more closely, ostensibly to admire Andrews's careful cultivation. The peppermint patch still bore evidence of hasty harvesting, with stems crudely broken rather than properly cut, a detail that troubled the meticulous gardener considerably. When Miss Marple mentioned that peppermint was particularly useful when one wished to mask unwanted tastes, Andrews nodded with practical understanding, noting that his late wife had always distinguished between spearmint for pleasure and peppermint for purpose. Eleanor Pemberton appeared in the garden at that moment, her pale figure moving with the careful steps of someone whose composure required constant maintenance. Miss Marple observed the brief contraction around Eleanor's mouth, when a breeze lifted a fragment of broken peppermint stem, sending it skittering across the soil, the kind of involuntary reaction that suggested uncomfortable recognition rather than casual observation. The afternoon brought additional revelations that transformed the investigation's scope entirely. Sergeant Vale's inquiry with Mrs. Beale, the cook, confirmed that the tray Maria had mentioned had indeed disappeared from the side table within minutes of being placed there. The kitchen maid, Bessie, recalled glimpsing a lady passing the doorway with a tray, dark skirt, small hands, an unidentifiable scent, and the distinctive clink of crystal. The assumption had been that Mrs. Hartwell was serving herself, though the timing suggested otherwise. As these details accumulated, Miss Marple found herself considering the psychological sophistication required for such careful planning. The killer had demonstrated intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's routines, medical vulnerabilities, and household arrangements while maintaining perfect composure throughout the investigation. Such calculated deception suggested someone whose professional or social position required regular study of human behavior and whose personal security depended upon avoiding detection. The evening brought an unexpected development when Catherine Hartwell arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, with information that cast the entire case in dramatically different light. Her discovery of locked correspondence in Mrs. Hartwell's writing desk revealed that the victim had been receiving threatening letters for weeks, not from creditors, but from someone demanding payment for their silence about the failed investments and the methods used to conceal them from Catherine. The letters spoke of exposure that would ruin not only Constance's reputation, but several other people's professional standing, Catherine explained, her distress evident in every word. The final letter, dated just 2 days before the garden party, demanded substantial payment in exchange for the return of certain compromising documents. This revelation of blackmail provided compelling new motives while explaining the sophisticated planning evident in the crime. If Mrs. Hartwell had been preparing to expose her blackmailer rather than submit to further extortion, murder became an act of desperate self-preservation rather than simple greed. The handwriting was unmistakably feminine, and the intimate knowledge of household arrangements suggested someone with regular access to Rosemere's domestic details. Most significantly, Catherine had discovered Mrs. Hartwell's appointment diary, which showed a meeting scheduled for the morning after the garden party, with someone identified only as E.P. The notation beside this appointment read, "Final discussion," with a note about bringing sufficient documentation to ensure mutual understanding. Mrs. Hartwell had clearly planned to confront her blackmailer directly, possibly with evidence that would turn the tables on her tormentor. Inspector Pierce's arrival during Catherine's revelations confirmed that his own investigation had reached similar conclusions through different evidence. His examination of Dr. Pemberton's records had revealed prescriptions for Mrs. Hartwell that were significantly stronger than typical anxiety medications, with dosage increases that coincided exactly with the escalation of her financial difficulties. Bank records showed regular cash withdrawals that corresponded to no legitimate expenses, amounts substantial enough to represent blackmail payments while being carefully structured to avoid scrutiny. The final withdrawal was made the day before the garden party. Pierce explained. £500 in cash, with Mrs. Hartwell's notation, stating final payment as agreed. She intended to end the arrangement permanently. As the evening progressed and the three discussed the accumulating evidence, Miss Marple reflected on how the various elements formed a coherent pattern of exploitation and desperation. Someone with medical knowledge had systematically exploited Mrs. Hartwell's vulnerabilities while maintaining a facade of helpful concern, demonstrating psychological sophistication that went far beyond simple criminal opportunism. The blackmail explained Eleanor's intimate knowledge of household routines, her access to medical information about Mrs. Hartwell's sedative medications, and her desperate need to prevent the confrontation that would have exposed months of systematic extortion. The wrong mint variety in the fatal cordial suggested someone working under extreme pressure, while the careful preparation in the morning room indicated confidence born of familiarity with the victim's private spaces. Most tellingly, the crime's timing had prevented not only Mrs. Hartwell's planned exposure of her blackmailer, but also the signing of the codicil that would have given Catherine immediate control of her inheritance. Eleanor had needed to act before Mrs. Hartwell could reveal the blackmail or transfer financial responsibility to someone who might discover the estate's true condition and investigate its depletion. As Miss Marple settled into her evening routine, she found herself thinking not about obvious motives or apparent opportunities, but about the psychological pressure that drove seemingly respectable people to contemplate murder as preferable to exposure. Eleanor Pemberton had possessed the perfect combination of medical knowledge, household access, and desperate necessity that made this particular crime both possible and, from her perspective, inevitable. The investigation had indeed reached its crucial turning point, where accumulated evidence was beginning to coalesce into undeniable proof of guilt. Tomorrow, Miss Marple anticipated, would bring the kind of confrontation that transforms suspicion into certainty, though she suspected that Eleanor's final revelations would prove both more complex and more tragic than anyone yet imagined. The truth, as always, would emerge not from dramatic accusations, but from the patient accumulation of small inconsistencies that revealed the careful planning behind apparent spontaneity. The real murderer had managed to remain safely in the background while others drew suspicion, but the net of evidence was closing with inexorable logic around someone whose understanding of human nature had ultimately betrayed her into believing that murder could be made to look like accident, and that careful planning could indefinitely postpone the consequences of desperate choices. The morning following Catherine's devastating discovery brought Inspector Pierce to Miss Marple's cottage with the measured urgency of a man whose investigation had reached another crucial juncture. The blackmail letters had been dispatched to Scotland Yard's forensic laboratory overnight, and Pierce carried himself with the careful optimism of someone who anticipated that scientific analysis would provide the definitive evidence that psychological observation had thus far only suggested. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, where the morning light filtered through lace curtains onto her inevitable knitting. She had spent the early hours reflecting on Eleanor Pemberton's obvious distress and the curious fact that someone capable of systematic blackmail had seemed genuinely terrified rather than merely concerned about discovery. In her experience, successful criminals typically displayed either cold calculation or theatrical remorse, rarely the kind of authentic fear that suggested someone caught in circumstances beyond their control. The laboratory results should provide clarity about the letter's authorship, Pierce explained, accepting the offered tea with gratitude. Mrs. Pemberton's connection to the household, her medical knowledge through her husband, and her obvious distress all point toward her involvement. Yet I confess, Miss Marple, that certain aspects of her behavior suggest complexity rather than straightforward guilt. Before Miss Marple could respond, the telephone's shrill interruption brought news that would transform the investigation entirely. Sergeant Vale's voice carried across the line with the tight urgency of someone conveying information that would shatter established assumptions and redirect the entire course of the inquiry. "Inspector, we've received the forensic report on those blackmail letters," Vale announced, his words measured but weighted with significance. "The handwriting analysis confirms deliberate disguise to suggest feminine authorship, but more importantly, the paper and ink match samples recovered from Mr. Whitfield's office during our initial document search. The stationery is distinctive, a particular weight and watermark that Whitfield orders specially for confidential correspondence." The revelation struck the small sitting room like a physical blow. Inspector Pierce's expression shifted from confident expectation to profound shock, his carefully constructed case against Eleanor Pemberton crumbling as new implications cascaded through his understanding of the crime. Miss Marple observed his reaction with quiet interest, noting how the inspector's professional certainty gave way to the kind of mental readjustment that accompanies fundamental revelations about human nature and criminal deception. "Whitfield," Pierce murmured, the name carrying entirely different weight now. The family solicitor, who had been so helpful in managing the crisis, so discreetly concerned about Catherine's welfare, so knowledgeable about the estate's complexities, suddenly emerged as a figure of sinister possibility rather than professional reliability. Miss Marple continued her gentle attention to the yellow wool while processing the implications of this development. Mr. Whitfield's intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's financial arrangements, his access to confidential information about the estate's true condition, and his professional understanding of legal vulnerabilities now took on an entirely different significance. The man who had revealed the financial irregularities might well have been their architect, using his position of trust to exploit his client, while simultaneously positioning himself to profit from her desperation. The timing becomes particularly significant when viewed from this perspective, Miss Marple observed softly. Mr. Whitfield was the one who pressed Mrs. Hartwell about the codicil, who had access to her private papers, and who would have understood exactly how the estate's depletion could be concealed until Catherine assumed control. If he was blackmailing her, then her planned confrontation with EP represented not just exposure, but complete professional and personal ruin. Pierce nodded grimly, his mind racing through the implications. The appointment notation in Mrs. Hartwell's diary, previously assumed to refer to Eleanor Pemberton, now suggested an entirely different meeting. Whitfield would have known about Mrs. Hartwell's intention to confront her blackmailer, perhaps even suggested the timing himself to maintain control over the situation. The garden party provided perfect cover for a crime that needed to appear spontaneous while being carefully orchestrated. His knowledge of household routines, his access to medical information through professional connections, his understanding of how the investigation would proceed, Pierce continued, building the case as the evidence realigned itself. He's been managing this crisis from the beginning, not as a concerned advisor, but as someone ensuring that suspicion fell on convenient targets while he remained safely in the background. The realization cast Eleanor Pemberton's distress in an entirely different light. Rather than the fear of someone whose guilt was being discovered, her anxiety might represent the terror of someone who had been manipulated into a compromising position by someone she trusted. Her husband's financial entanglement with Mrs. Hartwell, her intimate knowledge of household arrangements, even her presence at the garden party, all could have been orchestrated by Whitfield to create a perfect alternative suspect when the inevitable investigation began. Miss Marple reflected on the sophisticated psychology required for such manipulation. Whitfield possessed not only the legal expertise to understand how evidence would be interpreted, but also the social position that allowed him to move freely through the household while directing attention toward more obvious suspects. His professional relationship with the family provided perfect camouflage for gathering information, preparing the crime, and subsequently managing the investigation's direction. The missing photograph becomes particularly significant in this context, Miss Marple noted. If it contained evidence of financial improprieties that Whitfield had orchestrated, its removal would have been essential to prevent Mrs. Hartwell from using it in her planned confrontation. He would have known exactly which documents posed the greatest threat to his security. As the morning progressed and Inspector Pierce began mentally reconstructing the case with Whitfield as the primary suspect, Miss Marple found herself considering the careful psychological manipulation that had nearly succeeded in directing guilt toward innocent parties. The wrong mint variety in Mrs. Hartwell's cordial, the heel prints in the herb garden, even Eleanor's obvious distress, all could have been elements in a sophisticated deception designed to create multiple alternative suspects while the true perpetrator remained safely invisible. The revelation about the stationery provided the kind of concrete evidence that transformed psychological suspicion into investigative certainty, yet Miss Marple understood that proving Whitfield's guilt would require more than forensic analysis. His legal training would have prepared him to avoid obvious mistakes, and his professional reputation provided a shield of respectability that would require careful dismantling. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "I believe Mr. Whitfield's next actions will prove most revealing. If he has indeed been orchestrating this deception, the discovery of his connection to the blackmail letters will force him to make choices that may finally expose his true nature. People under such pressure rarely maintain their careful facades indefinitely." Pierce nodded, understanding the psychological trap that was beginning to close around their new suspect. The investigation had indeed taken another dramatic turn, revealing layers of deception that went far beyond simple murder to encompass systematic exploitation, professional betrayal, and the kind of calculated manipulation that transformed trusted advisors into predators. The truth, as Miss Marple had long suspected, was proving both more complex and more disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. As they prepared to confront this new reality, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human nature well enough to exploit it, using trust and professional authority to mask their true intentions until exposure became inevitable. Tomorrow would bring the kind of confrontation that would finally strip away Whitfield's carefully maintained facade and reveal the calculating mind that had nearly succeeded in committing the perfect crime. The morning following the forensic revelation about Mr. Whitfield's stationery brought Inspector Pierce to Miss Marple's cottage with the measured urgency of a man whose investigation had reached a critical juncture, yet who understood that premature action might allow a sophisticated criminal to escape through legal technicalities. The laboratory results had provided the first concrete evidence linking Whitfield to the blackmail scheme, but Pierce's experience had taught him that respected professionals possessed resources and knowledge that made direct confrontation potentially disastrous without overwhelming proof. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room, where the morning light revealed her knitting progressing steadily on what appeared to be a child's yellow cardigan. though her attention was clearly focused on the psychological complexities that the case had revealed. She had spent the early hours reflecting on the curious fact that someone capable of systematic blackmail and calculated murder had managed to position himself as the helpful advisor throughout the investigation, directing suspicion toward others while remaining safely invisible. The challenge, Inspector, is that Mr. Whitfield's legal training will have prepared him for exactly this sort of accusation, Miss Marple observed gently. He will have anticipated that forensic analysis might eventually trace the stationery, and he will have prepared explanations that cast doubt on its significance. We need evidence that reveals not just his connection to the crime, but his state of mind and his actions in response to pressure. Pierce nodded grimly, understanding that they required more than circumstantial evidence to build a case against someone whose professional reputation provided such powerful camouflage. I propose we visit his offices this morning, ostensibly to clarify certain estate matters. His reactions to subtle pressure might reveal more than direct accusations ever could. Their arrival at Whitfield's chambers in the Georgian building off the High Street immediately provided the kind of evidence that transformed suspicion into near certainty. The brass nameplate still gleamed with professional respectability, but the interior carried the unmistakable scent of burned paper despite the mild weather that made fireplace use unnecessary. Young Mr. Hanbury, the nervous clerk with ink-stained cuffs, greeted them with obvious relief at having someone in authority to whom he could report the previous night's mysterious fire. "Most peculiar, Inspector," Hanbury explained, leading them toward the back office where a filing cabinet stood with its door blackened and forced open. "I returned late last evening after forgetting my umbrella and discovered flames in this cabinet. Fortunately, I arrived in time to prevent the fire spreading, but one entire section of confidential files was destroyed. Mr. Whitfield attributed it to faulty wiring, though I must confess the smell reminded me more of lamp oil than electrical burning." Pierce examined the damaged cabinet with professional thoroughness, noting how the destruction had been selective rather than random. The burned files appeared to have been specifically chosen, with surrounding documents remaining untouched. Most significantly, he discovered a partially burned filing label that had fallen behind the cabinet, its lettering still legible despite the charring: E.P. Elm Park Holdings. Miss Marple felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle piece sliding into place. The mysterious E.P. from Mrs. Hartwell's diary had never referred to Eleanor Pemberton at all, but to a company name that provided perfect camouflage for a solicitor conducting business he preferred to keep separate from his legitimate practice. The appointment Mrs. Hartwell had scheduled for the day after the garden party had been intended as a confrontation with Elm Park Holdings, not a social call to Eleanor. "Mr. Hanbury," Miss Marple inquired with gentle curiosity, "had Mr. Whitfield mentioned this company name in your hearing? I ask only because it seems to have been important enough to merit its own confidential file." The young clerk's response proved illuminating. Elm Park Holdings had been mentioned frequently in recent months, always in connection with property transactions and investment opportunities that Whitfield described as requiring discretion. The company appeared to specialize in acquiring distressed estates, though Hanbury had never seen documentation of its actual ownership or management structure. When Whitfield himself appeared, summoned by news of their visit, his usual composed efficiency showed subtle cracks under the strain of maintaining normalcy while managing crisis. His greeting carried professional courtesy, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes immediately sought the damaged filing cabinet and how his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he surveyed the destruction. "Terribly inconvenient, this electrical fault," Whitfield said, his voice carefully modulated, though slightly hoarse. "Fortunately, most of the important documents were duplicated elsewhere, though some confidential correspondence may have been lost permanently." Inspector Pierce's questioning proved both subtle and revealing. Rather than confronting Whitfield about the blackmail letters directly, he focused on the estate's financial complexities, allowing the solicitor to demonstrate his intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's vulnerabilities while gradually tightening the net of implication. Whitfield's responses revealed not only detailed familiarity with her habits and fears, but also sophisticated understanding of how her medical condition could be exploited for criminal purposes. Mrs. Hartwell had become increasingly paranoid about her financial situation, Whitfield explained, unconsciously positioning himself as the patient advisor managing an unstable client. She was convinced that someone was monitoring her activities, preparing to expose her difficulties for personal gain. I had been counseling her that such fears were largely unfounded, though recent events suggest her instincts may have been more accurate than I initially believed. Miss Marple observed Whitfield's behavioral patterns during this explanation, noting how his fingers repeatedly touched the damaged filing cabinet and how his gaze avoided direct contact when discussing Mrs. Hartwell's supposed paranoia. The performance was skillful, but it carried the quality of something rehearsed rather than spontaneously recalled, suggesting someone who had prepared explanations for exactly this sort of scrutiny. The conversation's most revealing moment came when Pierce casually mentioned the missing photograph from Mrs. Hartwell's family album. Whitfield's reaction, a sharp intake of breath followed by rapid blinking, provided unmistakable confirmation of recognition and concern. His subsequent explanation, while superficially reasonable, carried the brittle quality of improvisation under pressure. Mrs. Hartwell had shown me several family photographs during our estate discussions, he said, his voice carefully controlled. She was particularly concerned about one image that showed her late husband with certain business associates involved in questionable investment schemes. She feared it might be used to implicate her in activities she had known nothing about. The explanation provided another layer to Whitfield's carefully constructed narrative, but it also revealed his knowledge of which specific evidence posed the greatest threat to his security. The photograph's removal, coinciding exactly with Mrs. Hartwell's planned confrontation with her blackmailer, demonstrated someone who understood precisely what documentation could expose his criminal activities. As they prepared to leave Whitfield's chambers, Miss Marple made one final observation that would prove crucial to understanding the crime's sophisticated planning. Among the professional photographs on his desk, she noticed an image from what appeared to be a medical conference, showing Whitfield standing beside Dr. Pemberton and several other gentlemen in formal attire. The picture suggested professional relationships that went beyond casual acquaintance, connections that could have provided access to medical knowledge essential for planning the perfect murder. The afternoon brought news of another development that confirmed their suspicions about Whitfield's desperation to eliminate evidence. Sergeant Vale reported that Rosemere had been burglarized during the night, with the intruder gaining access through the morning room window, the same room where Mrs. Hartwell had died. The break-in had been surgical in its precision, targeting only Mrs. Hartwell's writing desk where the blackmail letters and appointment diary had been stored. Nothing else was disturbed, Vale explained to Pierce over the telephone. The burglar knew exactly what he was seeking and where to find it. Andrews discovered footprints in the herb garden, broad-soled shoes with straight heels, not the pointed elegance we found earlier. Someone familiar with the house, layout, moving with confidence despite the darkness. The timing of this evidence destruction, occurring within hours of the forensic report's circulation, demonstrated the kind of calculated response that confirmed Whitfield's guilt while revealing his growing desperation. The careful planning that had characterized the original crime was giving way to increasingly risky attempts to eliminate incriminating evidence, suggesting someone whose psychological control was beginning to fracture under sustained pressure. During the drive back to St. Mary Mead, Inspector Pierce reflected on the day's accumulating evidence with growing certainty about their suspect's identity and methods. "The psychological sophistication is remarkable," he observed. "Whitfield has managed to position himself as the concerned advisor while systematically exploiting his client's vulnerabilities. The blackmail scheme, the manipulation of evidence, even the timing of the murder, everything designed to direct suspicion toward obvious targets while he remained safely invisible. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, considering how the various elements formed a coherent pattern of professional betrayal and criminal exploitation. The most dangerous criminals, Inspector, are often those who understand human nature well enough to manipulate it effectively. Mr. Whitfield has spent years observing how people behave under pressure, how they react to threats, and how they can be led to incriminate themselves or others. Such knowledge, when applied to criminal purposes, creates deceptions that are extraordinarily difficult to unravel. As evening approached and they contemplated the next phase of their investigation, Miss Marple found herself thinking not about dramatic confrontations or legal procedures, but about the psychological trap that was beginning to close around their suspect. Whitfield's attempts to eliminate evidence had revealed the extent of his desperation, while providing concrete proof of his guilt. The careful facade of professional respectability was cracking under the pressure of accumulated contradictions that could no longer be explained away through legal expertise and calculated misdirection. "I believe, Inspector, that the time has come for a more direct approach," Miss Marple said gently as they reached her cottage gate. "Not accusations or dramatics, but a quiet gathering where Mr. Whitfield can demonstrate his true nature under circumstances he cannot entirely control. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are managing a crisis, and I suspect our solicitor has reached the point where his careful planning will give way to the kind of mistakes that expose the truth." The investigation had indeed reached its crucial turning point, where psychological pressure and accumulated evidence were beginning to coalesce into undeniable proof of guilt. Tomorrow would bring the kind of confrontation that would finally strip away Whitfield's carefully maintained facade and reveal the calculating mind that had nearly succeeded in committing the perfect crime, using professional authority and intimate knowledge of human weakness to mask murder as natural death, while directing suspicion toward innocent victims of his own manipulation. The morning following Whitfield's desperate evidence destruction brought Inspector Pierce to Miss Marple's cottage with a proposal that demonstrated both professional cunning and psychological insight. Rather than attempting a direct confrontation that would allow Whitfield to deploy his legal expertise defensively, Pierce suggested orchestrating a gathering where the solicitor's reactions could be observed under controlled pressure, allowing his true nature to reveal itself through the kind of subtle behavioral inconsistencies that Miss Marple had learned to recognize over decades of village observation. Miss Marple received this suggestion with quiet approval, understanding that the most effective way to expose a sophisticated criminal was often to create circumstances where their careful planning gave way to spontaneous reactions. She had observed through many years of human nature that people revealed their deepest truths not through dramatic confessions, but through small gestures that betrayed the gap between their public personas and private realities. The key, Inspector, will be presenting Mr. Whitfield with situations that force him to respond without adequate preparation time, Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "He has spent considerable effort managing this crisis through careful misdirection, but if we can introduce elements he has not anticipated, his responses may reveal more than he intends." By afternoon, the gathering at Rosemere had been arranged with the kind of careful orchestration that matched Whitfield's own methods. Catherine had agreed to host what appeared to be a final discussion of estate matters, with the principal parties assembled ostensibly to resolve remaining administrative complexities. The guests included Dr. and Mrs. Pemberton, Julian Vance, and naturally Mr. Whitfield himself, whose legal expertise would be essential for concluding the estate's affairs. Miss Marple arrived with Mrs. Bantry, her knitting bag and gentle demeanor providing perfect camouflage for acute observation. She positioned herself in a chair near the French doors where the afternoon light would allow her to observe facial expressions and behavioral patterns while remaining safely invisible to those whose attention was focused on more obvious concerns. The drawing room carried an atmosphere of subdued tension, with each participant understanding that their words and actions might influence the investigation's final conclusions. Catherine had chosen this location deliberately, avoiding the psychological weight of the morning room while providing excellent sight lines for observation. The arrangement of furniture seemed casual, but had been subtly adjusted to ensure that no one could avoid being observed during the proceedings. Whitfield arrived with characteristic punctuality, carrying his leather document case and wearing the expression of professional competence that had served him throughout the crisis. His greeting to each person present demonstrated perfect social calibration, though Miss Marple noted how his eyes continuously surveyed the room as if cataloguing potential threats or opportunities for advantage. The discussion began with mundane estate matters, allowing each participant to settle into familiar roles while Miss Marple observed their behavioral patterns. Catherine's questions about the codicil's legal implications prompted detailed explanations from Whitfield that revealed his intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's intentions and concerns, though he presented this information as the natural result of professional consultation rather than something more sinister. "I wonder, Mr. Whitfield," Miss Marple said gently during a pause in the conversation, "if you might be so kind as to help us understand something about Mrs. Hartwell's domestic preferences." Catherine mentioned that her stepmother was quite particular about her elderflower cordial, especially the choice of garnish. The request appeared innocent enough, the sort of domestic detail that elderly ladies might find fascinating. Whitfield responded with practiced courtesy, explaining that Mrs. Hartwell had indeed been meticulous about such matters, preferring spearmint for its delicate flavor and always using a glass, with a small scratch on the base that allowed her to identify her own refreshment during social gatherings. "How very observant of you to notice such details," Miss Marple murmured approvingly. "I suppose that comes from years of managing household arrangements during your visits. You would know, for instance, exactly how she preferred her cordial prepared and served." The comment carried no apparent significance, yet Miss Marple observed the slight tightening around Whitfield's eyes and the way his fingers pressed against the leather of his document case. The involuntary responses suggested someone whose carefully prepared explanations were being challenged by implications he had not fully anticipated. Inspector Pierce's arrival provided the next crucial element in their psychological strategy. Rather than announcing dramatic revelations, he began with seemingly routine questions about the afternoon of the garden party, allowing each person to reconfirm their previous statements while subtly introducing new information that tested their consistency and reactions. "We have made some interesting discoveries about the missing photograph," Pierce announced casually, producing a manila envelope from his coat. The laboratory analysis revealed something quite significant about both its contents and the timing of its removal. Miss Marple observed each person's reaction with careful attention. Eleanor's relief was visible and genuine. Dr. Pemberton nodded with professional interest. Julian appeared puzzled but unconcerned, and Catherine frowned with the confusion of someone trying to understand new information about her own household. Whitfield's reaction, however, carried the quality of controlled calculation, not shock at unexpected information, but careful assessment of how to respond to a development that threatened his security. The photograph showed Mrs. Hartwell's late husband at a regimental dinner, Pierce continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the weight of his implications. More importantly, it included several civilian guests whose presence at that particular event has proved significant to our investigation. One of these gentlemen has been identified as closely connected to Elm Park Holdings. The name struck the room with devastating effect, though each person's reaction revealed different levels of recognition and concern. Whitfield's face maintained professional composure, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands and the way his breathing became more shallow and controlled. "Perhaps, Mr. Whitfield," Miss Marple said with gentle curiosity, "you could help us understand the relationship between Mrs. Hartwell's estate and this company. Your professional expertise would be invaluable in clarifying these complex financial arrangements." The request forced Whitfield into a position where silence would appear suspicious, while detailed explanation might reveal more than he intended. His response, carefully modulated, though slightly strained, demonstrated the kind of professional deflection that had served him throughout the crisis. Elm Park Holdings was involved in several property transactions that Mrs. Hartwell had been considering. He explained, his voice carrying practiced authority. The arrangements were complex, involving multiple parties and requiring considerable discretion. Mrs. Hartwell had been growing increasingly concerned about certain aspects of these dealings. Miss Marple found this admission significant for what it revealed about Whitfield's intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's concerns and his efforts to manage her response to the financial deception. The careful phrasing suggested someone who understood exactly what evidence she possessed and how dangerous its disclosure might prove. "It's curious," Miss Marple observed, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm, "how Mrs. Hartwell's appointment diary shows a meeting scheduled with E.P. for the day after the garden party. Such a coincidence that those initials should match Elm Park Holdings, don't you think?" The psychological pressure was building systematically, each revelation adding weight to the accumulating evidence while forcing Whitfield to respond without adequate preparation time. His explanations, while maintaining surface plausibility, carried the increasing strain of someone whose careful planning was being systematically dismantled. Inspector Pierce provided the final crucial element when he produced Mrs. Hartwell's appointment diary, recovered before the burglary could eliminate this crucial evidence. "The entry is quite specific," he explained. "Final discussion. Bring all documentation." Mrs. Hartwell had clearly planned to confront someone about the estate's financial irregularities. The implication was devastating in its clarity. Mrs. Hartwell had trusted her legal advisor completely, planning to seek his guidance in confronting the very criminal enterprise he had been orchestrating. The appointment represented not just exposure, but complete professional and personal destruction for someone who had spent months carefully manipulating the situation to his advantage. Miss Marple watched as Whitfield's psychological control finally began to fracture under the accumulated pressure. His admission, when it came, carried the exhausted quality of someone whose elaborate deceptions had finally collapsed under the weight of irrefutable evidence and relentless psychological pressure. "She would have destroyed everything," he said quietly, his professional composure giving way to genuine desperation. "Not just my practice, but everything I'd worked to build. She had documentation that would have exposed arrangements that were perfectly legal but would have been misunderstood by people who don't appreciate the complexities of estate management." The confession that followed revealed the sophisticated planning that had nearly succeeded in creating the perfect crime, using professional knowledge and intimate access to exploit a client's vulnerabilities while directing suspicion toward innocent parties. The psychological manipulation had been extraordinary in its complexity, demonstrating how someone's trust could be weaponized against them while maintaining the appearance of helpful concern. As Inspector Pierce formally arrested Whitfield for the murder of Mrs. Constance Hartwell, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human nature well enough to exploit it systematically. The investigation had revealed not just a single crime, but a pattern of professional betrayal that had transformed trusted relationships into instruments of exploitation and ultimately murder. The truth had indeed emerged through patient observation and psychological insight rather than dramatic revelation, proving once again that the most sophisticated deceptions could be unraveled by careful attention to the small inconsistencies that betrayed the gap between appearance and reality. Justice would be served, though the damage to trust and community would require considerably longer to heal than the legal proceedings would take to conclude. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Rosemere's carefully tended gardens, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed truth triumph over deception through the simple but powerful application of human understanding and patient observation. The lady who had forgotten to live had finally received the justice she deserved, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the gentle persistence of those who understood that the most profound truths often emerged from the smallest details of human behavior. The removal of Mr. Whitfield from Rosemare's drawing room in handcuffs left behind a profound silence that seemed to echo with the weight of shattered trust and revealed deceptions. The man who had guided Little Wickham's most prominent families through their legal complexities for years had been exposed as the architect of systematic exploitation, transforming professional relationships built on confidence into instruments of blackmail and ultimately murder. Inspector Pierce remained by the mantel, his notebook closed, understanding that the formal confession was complete, but that the human aftermath required careful attention to heal properly. Miss Marple continued her gentle attention to the yellow wool in her lap, providing the comfortable framework of domestic routine that often helped people process shocking revelations. Her explanation, when it came, carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing a familiar recipe, though the ingredients in this case had been trust, manipulation, and deadly calculation. "It began long before the garden party," she said softly, her voice drawing the room's attention like a magnet. Mr. Whitfield understood Mrs. Hartwell's character perfectly. Her pride, her fears, her little domestic preferences. He knew she took spearmint in her cordial and required afternoon sedatives for her increasing anxiety. Most importantly, he knew she would never suspect danger in her own morning room, where she felt most secure. Eleanor Pemberton's hands, which had been clenched tightly throughout the ordeal, finally relaxed as Miss Marple's gentle gaze fell upon her with unmistakable kindness. "You were used, my dear, as we all were in different ways. When you fetched peppermint from the herb garden at someone's request, you believed you were performing a kindness. The broken stems, the heel marks in the damp earth, the scent of violets and your sapphire brooch, all genuine evidence, but evidence of innocence rather than guilt." Dr. Pemberton's professional composure cracked as he absorbed the full scope of how his medical knowledge had been exploited. "I increased her sedative dosage because her agitation was worsening," he admitted hoarsely. "I thought I was providing proper medical care, not making her more vulnerable to murder." Miss Marple inclined her head with neither condemnation nor absolution. Mr. Whitfield relied on that sedation to dull her reactions and mask the bitter taste of the poison. He prepared the cherry laurel water in the morning room itself. There were traces on the windowsill where he worked. He wiped the glass clean before adding the cordial, ensuring only Mrs. Hartwell's fingerprints would remain. The peppermint garnish was his one significant error, suggesting someone working under pressure rather than with his usual meticulous attention to detail. Catherine's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "The photograph she went to fetch. There never was one, was there?" "No, my dear. That excuse was fabricated to ensure she would go to the morning room alone where the prepared cordial waited. The photograph that mattered had been removed from the album days earlier because it contained evidence linking Mr. Whitfield to questionable financial arrangements. E.P. In her appointment diary never referred to Eleanor Pemberton. It was Elm Park Holdings, his own creation. The confession that followed, extracted from Whitfield before his removal, had revealed the extraordinary scope of his criminal enterprise. For months, he had systematically exploited his position as trusted legal advisor to siphon funds from clients' estates through fabricated investment opportunities. Mrs. Hartwell's growing suspicion and her planned confrontation with her supposed blackmailer, who was, of course, Whitfield himself, had threatened to expose not just the financial fraud, but years of professional betrayal disguised as helpful counsel. "She would have destroyed everything I had built," Whitfield had said, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. "My practice, my reputation, my standing in the community. People don't understand the complexities of estate management, the risks involved in protecting their interests. She saw only betrayal where I saw necessary measures to preserve what could be saved." His description of the murder's planning had been chillingly methodical. The garden party had provided perfect cover, with multiple witnesses and social chaos masking his brief absence to prepare the fatal drink. He had known Mrs. Hartwell's routines intimately, from her preference for the morning room during private moments to her habit of using a glass with a distinctive scratch on its base. The timing had been calculated to coincide with her regular afternoon medication, ensuring maximum vulnerability while maintaining the appearance of natural death. Julian Vance's relief was profound and visible as the cloud of suspicion finally lifted from his relationship with Catherine. His financial difficulties had been real, but they had made him a convenient target for misdirection rather than a motive for murder. "I never imagined," he said quietly, "that someone could orchestrate such elaborate deceptions while maintaining the appearance of helpful concern." Eleanor Pemberton wept openly, her earlier terror giving way to the complex emotions of someone who had been manipulated into unwitting participation in a crime she never could have imagined. Her husband's professional entanglements had made them vulnerable to exploitation, but they had been victims rather than perpetrators, their genuine medical concerns weaponized against both them and Mrs. Hartwell. As the immediate crisis began to settle into the kind of shocked acceptance that follows dramatic revelations, Inspector Pierce reflected on the psychological sophistication that had nearly allowed Whitfield to escape justice entirely. The manipulation extended far beyond the immediate crime, he observed. Every aspect of the subsequent investigation was managed to direct suspicion toward convenient targets while he remained safely in the background, offering helpful advice and professional guidance. Catherine rose and moved to the window overlooking the herb garden, where the peppermint patch still showed signs of hasty harvesting. "There is so much to rebuild," she said, not to anyone in particular. "The estate, the household, the trust that held this community together. How does one recover from such systematic betrayal?" Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. "You will rebuild it, my dear, because that is what people do. Your stepmother meant to trust you completely at the end. The codicil she planned to sign was genuine, even if her advisor was not. You can honor her intentions while learning from her vulnerabilities." As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the various participants began to process their individual roles in the tragedy, Andrews the gardener appeared discreetly at the door to ask about the damaged peppermint beds. The question, practical and immediate, drew an unexpected smile from Catherine as life gently reminded her that it required ongoing attention despite dramatic interruptions. "Leave them as they are for now," she decided. "I should like to remember, at least for a while." The drive back to St. Mary Mead took place in companionable quiet, with Mrs. Bantry respecting Miss Marple's need to process the day's revelations. The familiar lanes and hedgerows provided comfort after the intensity of Rosemere's drawing room, where years of careful deception had finally been stripped away to reveal the calculating mind beneath. "I have learned more in these past days than in years of formal training," Inspector Pierce had confided before their departure. "It is as you said, Miss Marple. People, not merely evidence, make the case. Understanding human nature tells you where to look for proof." "Proofs are indeed valuable, Inspector," Miss Marple had replied with genuine appreciation for methodical investigation. "But one must first know where to seek them, and that knowledge comes from observing how people behave when they believe themselves unobserved." As evening settled over St. Mary Mead and Miss Marple prepared her customary tea, she reflected on the curious fact that the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human psychology well enough to exploit it systematically. Whitfield's crimes had violated not just legal boundaries, but the social contracts that made civilized community life possible, using professional authority and cultivated respectability to mask predatory behavior. The yellow cardigan in her knitting basket was nearly complete now, its cheerful color unchanged by the dark revelations it had witnessed. Row by row, stitch by careful stitch, it had grown while a murder was unraveled, each element as necessary as the clues that had eventually exposed the truth. Miss Marple smiled slightly as she considered the parallel. Both required patience, attention to detail, and understanding that the final pattern emerged only when all the pieces were properly connected. Little Wickham would eventually return to its peaceful rhythms, though forever changed by the knowledge that respectability could mask the darkest intentions and that the most trusted figures might harbor the most dangerous secrets. The lady who had forgotten to live had finally received justice, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient application of human understanding and careful observation that recognized how trust could be betrayed while never being permanently destroyed. As Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with tea and knitting, she reflected that truth once discovered required no ceremony or celebration. It simply needed to be lived with quietly, like yellow wool, light enough for innocence, strong enough to provide warmth and comfort to those who needed protection from the cold realities of human nature at its most calculating and cruel. The investigation was closed, but its lessons about the fragility of trust and the importance of genuine understanding would remain long after the legal proceedings concluded, and little Wickham returned to the gentle gossip and small concerns that knitted communities together, despite their occasional encounters with the darker aspects of human behavior. The weeks following Whitfield's arrest brought to little Wickham the peculiar quality of aftermath that follows profound betrayal. A collective exhale mixed with the unsettling realization that familiar foundations had shifted beneath everyone's feet. Miss Marple observed this community adjustment with the patient interest she brought to all human behavior, noting how different personalities responded to discovering that their most trusted legal advisor had been systematically exploiting the very people who had sought his protection. The Morning Post brought Inspector Pierce with news that provided both closure and troubling insight into the scope of Whitfield's deception. The photograph that had been removed from Mrs. Hartwell's album had been discovered hidden behind a loose panel in the solicitor's office, bearing pencil notations that identified key figures in the fraudulent investment scheme. More significantly, Pierce reported that Whitfield's confession had revealed the extraordinary psychological detachment that had allowed him to rationalize systematic exploitation as professional service. He showed no genuine remorse, Pierce explained, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with the weary satisfaction of a case properly concluded. Only continued resentment that his clients had failed to appreciate his efforts on their behalf. Such complete disconnection from moral consequences explains how he maintained his facade for so long, while orchestrating increasingly elaborate deceptions. Miss Marple found this assessment unsurprising, having observed that the most dangerous criminals often possessed sophisticated mental constructions that preserved their self-image while justifying destructive actions. Whitfield's legal training had provided perfect tools for such rationalization, transforming theft into asset management and murder into necessary intervention to protect his carefully constructed criminal enterprise. The afternoon brought Eleanor Pemberton to the cottage, accompanied by Maria from Rosemere, both carrying the burden of guilt that required careful untangling before healing could begin. Miss Marple received them with tea and seed cake, understanding that some confessions required the comfortable framework of domestic routine to emerge properly. Maria spoke first, her words tumbling out with the relief of someone finally able to share a terrible secret. "I didn't know I was doing wrong, miss. Mr. Whitfield asked so kindly. Said Mrs. Hartwell would be grateful for a fresh cordial in the morning room. He told me exactly where to leave the tray, just inside the French doors. Said the lady with the violet scent would take it in." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Only when I came back, the tray wasn't there anymore." Eleanor's hands trembled as she absorbed the full implications of how she had been manipulated. He had called that morning, flurried and apologetic, asking if I might bring peppermint for Mrs. Hartwell's upset stomach. Said Mrs. Beale was too busy to leave the kitchen. Her voice carried the weight of self-recrimination. I went to the herb bed. The earth was soft from recent rain, and I broke the stems carelessly, like a schoolgirl. I put the sprigs in the small jug by the scullery sink, thinking I had done a kindness. Miss Marple's response was firm enough to startle both women. You are not made into fools, my dears. Good people are not foolish because they believe requests made in the proper tone of voice. Mr. Whitfield understood tone perfectly, just as he understood that peppermint masks bitterness better than spearmint. When the herb was available and associated with your perfume and brooch, Eleanor, he had the shape of an alibi ready-made. The relief that followed this gentle absolution was profound and visible. Eleanor's trembling ceased, while Maria's shoulders straightened as the crushing weight of imagined complicity lifted. Miss Marple had observed many times that guilt, once properly addressed and understood, often transformed into strength rather than weakness. The inquest that followed provided little, Wickham with the official closure that legal proceedings require, though the community's real healing would take considerably longer. The coroner's careful questions and the jury's decisive verdict established the facts with satisfying clarity, while Dr. Pemberton's testimony about the sedatives demonstrated professional integrity despite personal cost. Eleanor sat near the back and maintained her composure throughout, her earlier confession having prepared her for public scrutiny. As autumn deepened and the immediate shock began to settle into permanent understanding, Miss Marple observed how little Wickham was processing the broader implications of such systematic betrayal. The village had learned to distinguish between healthy skepticism and destructive cynicism, understanding that trust remained essential while verification provided necessary protection. Catherine Hartwell had emerged from the crisis with remarkable strength, transforming her temporary residence at Rosemere into permanent commitment to rebuilding both the estate and its reputation. Her engagement to Julian Vance had been quietly announced, though the ceremony would wait until the estate's recovery was complete. Miss Marple approved of this measured approach, recognizing that relationships tested by crisis required careful tending to flourish in calmer circumstances. Julian himself had surprised everyone by demonstrating genuine aptitude for estate management, his London background proving valuable in identifying and correcting Whitfield's sophisticated financial deceptions. His relationship with Catherine had deepened through shared work rather than romantic idealization, creating the kind of practical foundation that Miss Marple recognized as more durable than passion alone. The herb garden at Rosemere had been restored under Andrew's careful supervision, with both spearmint and peppermint returned to their proper abundance. Catherine had decided to maintain the traditional layout, while adding discreet protective measures that would prevent unauthorized access to potentially dangerous plants. The practical precautions reflected broader understanding that beauty and safety could coexist with proper attention and planning. As winter approached and Miss Marple completed her new knitting project, soft blue wool that would become another child's cardigan, she reflected on how the case had demonstrated both human vulnerability and resilience. The investigation had revealed how trust could be systematically exploited, but it had also shown how genuine understanding and patient observation could ultimately expose even the most sophisticated deceptions. Mrs. Hartwell's death remained a tragedy, but her life's final chapter had inadvertently provided little Wickham with valuable education about maintaining healthy balance between necessary trust and prudent verification. The community would be more careful in the future without becoming cynical, a distinction that Miss Marple considered crucial for preserving the social bonds that made civilized life possible. The evening brought news that Whitfield's sentencing had been completed, with the judge's remarks emphasizing the particular gravity of crimes that violated professional trust and endangered vulnerable clients. The legal proceedings were finally concluded, though Miss Marple understood that the real work of recovery and rebuilding would continue for years to come. As she settled into her familiar chair with her knitting and evening tea, Miss Marple reflected that justice had been served not through dramatic revelation, but through patient attention to small inconsistencies that revealed larger truths. The case had demonstrated once again that the most profound insights often emerged from careful observation of human behavior rather than sensational discoveries or forensic evidence. The lady who had forgotten to live had received the justice she deserved, while little Wickham had learned valuable lessons about balancing trust with wisdom. Row by row, stitch by careful stitch, the work of rebuilding continued. In wool, in relationships, and in the patient understanding that truth, once discovered, required no ceremony, but simply needed to be lived with quietly and integrated into the ongoing fabric of community life. The yellow wool had given way to soft blue, another small garment that would provide comfort and protection to someone who needed such simple gifts. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure, woven into little Wickham's collective memory like careful stitches that created warmth and beauty from simple materials, guided by experienced hands and patient understanding of human nature in all its complexity. Winter settled over little Wickham with gentle persistence, frost etching delicate patterns on cottage windows, while the village gradually knitted itself back together around the wound that betrayal had torn in its fabric. Miss Marple observed this healing process from her sitting room, where Inspector Pierce had arrived on a crystalline morning, with both gratitude and lingering questions that only she could properly address. I confess, Miss Marple, that while justice has been served, I find myself still puzzling over the precise moments when you knew, Pierce said, accepting tea with the comfortable familiarity of someone whose respect had been earned through shared investigation. Not suspected, but truly knew that Whitfield was our man. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered her response, the blue wool growing steadily beneath her practiced fingers. It was not one moment, Inspector, but rather an accumulation of small inconsistencies that revealed the careful planning beneath apparent spontaneity. The errand that never existed, Mrs. Hartwell's supposed search for a photograph, told me of deliberate misdirection. A glass waiting precisely where it needed to be, wiped clean of all prints save the victim's, spoke of methodical preparation. She paused, her gentle gaze moving to the window where winter light filtered through lace curtains. But it was the peppermint that made me think most carefully. Mrs. Hartwell had always used spearmint in her cordial. Andrews confirmed this when I asked about her gardening preferences. Someone had chosen the wrong variety, either through ignorance of her habits or haste under pressure. When I observed Eleanor's broken stems and heel marks in the herb garden, I understood she had been manipulated into providing the garnish, but the error suggested someone else's hand in the final preparation. Inspector Pierce leaned forward with professional interest. Your test during our gathering at Rosemere, I sensed you were observing something specific. Indeed. I had asked Catherine to place 2 mint sprigs on the tea tray without remark. 1 spearmint, 1 peppermint. When Mr. Whitfield spoke so confidently about Mrs. Hartwell's preferences, his hand moved unconsciously to the dish. He touched the peppermint immediately, pinching the stem exactly where it would break most easily. Such familiarity spoke of recent handling, not casual observation. Miss Marple's explanation continued with the methodical precision that had characterized her investigation. There was also his language, Inspector. When discussing Mrs. Hartwell's fears about exposure, he twice used the present tense before correcting himself. She worries. Worried. It suggested someone whose mind had been living too intimately with another person's anxieties, not merely advising about them professionally. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an invitation that marked little Wickham's emergence from tragedy's shadow. Catherine Hartwell and Julian Vance requested Miss Marple's presence at their wedding, to be celebrated in the parish church with a reception following in Rosemere's restored gardens. The simple elegance of the invitation spoke to Catherine's character. No ostentation, but genuine warmth and recognition of those who had supported her through darkness into light. The wedding itself, held on a bright April morning when spring had fully claimed the countryside, provided exactly what the community needed. Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction how the various participants had been transformed by their ordeal. Catherine possessed new confidence born of successfully managing crisis, while Julian demonstrated the steady reliability that emerged from being tested under extreme circumstances. Their vows carried weight that came from shared struggle rather than romantic idealization. The reception in Rosemere's gardens provided profound symbolic healing. Tables were arranged among the same rose beds where Mrs. Hartwell's garden party had ended so tragically, but the atmosphere carried celebration rather than morbid remembrance. The herb garden flourished under Andrews's devoted care, both spearmint and peppermint growing in healthy abundance, their potential for healing and harm now properly understood and managed. Dr. Geoffrey Pemberton attended with Eleanor, both bearing the quiet dignity of people who had survived manipulation and emerged stronger for the experience. Eleanor's transformation was particularly remarkable, from terrified victim to someone who had found strength in understanding that being deceived was not the same as being foolish. Her husband had rebuilt his practice through renewed dedication to genuine service, having learned the bitter lesson of how professional relationships could be exploited by those who understood human vulnerability. During the reception, Inspector Pierce reflected on how the case had expanded his understanding of criminal psychology. "The investigation taught me to look beyond obvious motives and forensic evidence," he confided to Miss Marple as they watched guests enjoying the afternoon sunshine. Understanding human nature proved more valuable than technical analysis, though both were necessary for complete resolution. Miss Marple nodded with gentle satisfaction. "People reveal themselves through small actions and unconscious gestures, Inspector. One must simply learn to observe patiently and interpret accurately what such revelations actually mean." Mr. Whitfield's greatest mistake was believing that careful planning could indefinitely postpone the consequences of systematic betrayal. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Catherine and Julian approached Miss Marple with gratitude that carried the depth of genuine understanding. "You gave me back my faith in human nature," Catherine said quietly. "Not naive trust, but the wisdom to distinguish between those who deserve confidence and those who exploit it." Julian added his own appreciation, acknowledging how Miss Marple's patient investigation had cleared his name while revealing truths that might otherwise have remained hidden. "You showed us that justice emerges not from dramatic accusations, but from careful attention to small details that reveal larger patterns of behavior." Miss Marple accepted their thanks with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose work had achieved its intended purpose. The case had been resolved through patient observation and psychological insight, rather than sensational revelation, proving once again that truth emerged most reliably through understanding human nature rather than pursuing theatrical solutions. As the guests began their departures and Rosemere settled into evening quiet, Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag and prepared for her own journey home. The blue cardigan was complete now, its soft stitches forming practical beauty that would provide comfort without ostentation. Row by careful row it had grown during the months of recovery and rebuilding, each element as necessary as the clues that had eventually exposed Whitfield's elaborate deception. During the drive back to St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Bantry reflected on the dramatic transformation since that terrible afternoon when they had discovered Mrs. Hartwell's body. "It seems almost impossible that such calculated evil could hide behind such respectable appearances," she observed with lingering amazement. "Yet that is precisely why such deceptions succeed initially," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "People expect criminals to appear criminal, not to present themselves as helpful advisors and trusted professionals. The most dangerous predators are often those who understand how to exploit such expectations while maintaining perfect facades of respectability." As they reached St. Mary Mead and Miss Marple prepared to settle into her evening routine, she reflected on how the case had demonstrated the delicate balance between necessary trust and prudent verification. Little Wickham had learned to maintain faith in human goodness while developing healthy skepticism, understanding that careful observation need not destroy community bonds, but could actually strengthen them by protecting against those who would exploit them. The investigation had concluded not with dramatic confrontation, but with quiet understanding that transformed suspicion into certainty through patient accumulation of evidence and careful interpretation of human behavior. Mrs. Constance Hartwell, the lady who had forgotten to live, had received the justice she deserved, while her community had gained invaluable education about maintaining the balance between trust and wisdom that made civilized life possible. As Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair with fresh knitting and evening tea, she reflected that the most profound truths often emerged not from sensational discoveries, but from careful attention to small details that revealed how people actually behaved when they believed themselves unobserved. The yellow wool had given way to soft blue, another small garment that would provide comfort and protection to someone who needed such simple gifts. Row by row, stitch by careful stitch, the work of living continued, in wool, in relationships, and in the quiet understanding that truth, once discovered and properly integrated, required no ceremony, but simply needed to be lived with gracefully. The garden party was over, the mystery solved, and life had returned to its gentle rhythms, forever enriched by the knowledge that patient observation and genuine human understanding could triumph over even the most sophisticated deceptions when guided by unwavering concern for justice and community welfare. Outside her cottage window, the first stars appeared in the deepening sky, and Miss Marple smiled with the quiet contentment of someone who had witnessed once again that while the world contained its share of calculated evil, it also possessed an abundance of fundamental goodness that, with proper tending, would always prove stronger in the end.